The sun rises over Maple Street, casting long shadows across well-maintained lawns and modest houses that speak of middle-class contentment. Margaret Thompson's house sits at the end of the street, distinguished by the most vibrant garden on the block, a riot of colors that suggests someone who still believes in beauty despite life's disappointments. Margaret Thompson, 62, sits on the edge of her bed, her silver hair catching the morning light filtering through sheer curtains. The room is neat but not sterile, decorated with the accumulated treasures of a life fully lived. Books on every surface, photographs spanning decades, a quilt her mother made 40 years ago. Today is different. Today is her birthday. And despite the accumulated wisdom of her years, she feels that familiar flutter of anticipation that birthdays bring, regardless of age. It's a hope she's carried since childhood, that someone, somewhere, remembers that this day matters. Margaret's eyes drift to the photograph on her nightstand, herself and her late husband Robert, at their wedding 35 years ago. Robert had been the keeper of occasions, the one who remembered not just birthdays, but the small anniversaries that mark a life lived together. The day they'd first met, the anniversary of their first kiss, the day they'd bought this house, the morning they'd brought David home from the hospital. She reaches for her phone, checking for messages with the careful hope of someone who's learned not to expect too much, but can't quite stop hoping. The screen shows only the standard notifications, weather updates, news alerts, promotional messages from stores she's visited once. Nothing personal. Nothing that acknowledges this day means anything special to anyone but herself. Margaret moves through her morning routine with the deliberate grace of someone who's learned to find meaning in small rituals. She prepares her coffee with the same precision she's perfected over decades, measuring the grounds exactly, waiting for the perfect brewing temperature, using the ceramic mug David had given her for Mother's Day 12 years ago, back when such gestures came naturally to him. The kitchen is the heart of the house, filled with the accumulated tools of someone who's cooked thousands of meals for a family that has since scattered to the winds. On the windowsill above the sink, herbs grow in small pots: basil, rosemary, thyme, tended with the same care she once devoted to raising David. As she sips her coffee, Margaret finds herself studying the collection of photographs arranged along the kitchen counter. There's David at 8, gap-toothed and laughing at something she'd said during a family picnic. Another shows them at his high school graduation, both beaming with pride as David held his diploma, the first in their family to graduate with honors. There's a photo from his law school graduation, where David looks confident and ambitious, ready to conquer the world. The most recent photo from 3 years ago shows them at a restaurant celebrating David's promotion to partner. But even in that image, captured during what should have been a moment of shared joy, there's something distant in David's expression, something that suggests he'd rather be elsewhere, checking his phone, managing the urgent demands of his increasingly complex life. Margaret's phone remains silent. She moves to her small home office, a converted spare bedroom where she keeps her correspondence organized in neat folders, her books arranged by subject, her volunteer work materials stored in labeled containers. This is where she writes thank you notes by hand, where she researches the animal shelter donations she coordinates, where she maintains the careful records of a woman who believes in doing things properly. She opens her laptop and checks her email, hoping perhaps for a message from David, or maybe from her sister Patricia in Portland, or even from one of her former colleagues from the library, where she worked for 32 years before retiring. The inbox contains the usual array of promotional emails, newsletters from organizations she supports, and automated reminders about appointments and obligations. Nothing personal. Nothing that acknowledges that Margaret Thompson exists as anything more than a consumer demographic or a database entry. Margaret closes the laptop and returns to the living room, settling into her favorite armchair, a well-worn leather piece that had belonged to Robert. The chair still holds the faint scent of his cologne, even after 5 years. She's kept it in the same position, angled toward the window where Robert used to sit and read his morning paper, commenting on the news with the dry humor she'd loved. She picks up a book from the side table, a biography of Eleanor Roosevelt that her book club is reading this month. But her eyes don't focus on the words. Instead, she finds herself thinking about birthdays past, about the evolution of celebration and expectation over the decades of her life. There was the year David turned 16, when she'd thrown him a surprise party that filled their house with laughter and chaos. She'd stayed up until 3 a.m, decorating the basement, making sure every detail was perfect. David had been genuinely surprised, genuinely happy. That was before life got complicated, before careers and marriages and divorces created distance between them, before every conversation became a careful navigation of topics that might trigger stress or conflict. She remembers her own 40th birthday, when Robert had surprised her with a weekend trip to Napa Valley. They'd spent 2 days wandering through vineyards, talking about their dreams, their fears, their hopes for David's future. Robert had been the one who always remembered, not just birthdays, but the small moments that made their life together feel significant. "You know what I love about you?" Robert had said during that trip, as they sat on a patio overlooking rolling hills of grapevines. "You notice things. You remember things. You make everything feel important." Now, sitting in his chair, Margaret feels the weight of solitude in a way that's different from loneliness. She's not lonely. She has her books, her garden, her weekly book club meetings, her volunteer work at the animal shelter. But solitude is different. It's the awareness that the people who once made her feel essential, irreplaceable, have moved on to lives where she occupies a smaller and smaller space. Margaret's relationship with David has evolved in ways she never anticipated. When he was young, she'd been the center of his world, the one who kissed scraped knees, helped with homework, listened to his dreams and fears. As he grew older, she'd remained his confidant, the one he called when college felt overwhelming, when he was nervous about job interviews, when he needed advice about relationships. But somewhere along the way, that dynamic had shifted. David's life had become increasingly compartmentalized, filled with professional obligations and personal complications that left little room for the kind of leisurely conversations they'd once shared. Their relationship had become functional rather than intimate, periodic check-ins rather than genuine connection. Margaret understands this intellectually. She knows that David's life is demanding, that his recent divorce has been emotionally and financially draining, that his career requires constant attention. But understanding doesn't diminish the gradual erosion of closeness, the way their conversations have become shorter, more perfunctory, focused on logistics rather than emotions. The morning passes slowly. Margaret tends to her garden, the one space where she feels completely competent and in control. She waters the flowers she's planted in careful arrangements, roses that require patient pruning, herbs that need daily attention, vegetables that will feed her through the summer months. The garden is her sanctuary, the place where she can create beauty without anyone's permission or approval. She prepares a simple breakfast, scrambled eggs, toast, fresh fruit from her own strawberry plants, and eats it while reading the morning news on her tablet. The world continues its relentless pace, filled with crises and celebrations, births and deaths, all of which seem to happen to other people in other places. By 11 o'clock, she's cleaned the house, organized her already organized bookshelves, and started a load of laundry. The domestic rhythms that once provided structure and meaning now feel like ways to fill time, to create the illusion of purpose without the underlying foundation of people who need her. The phone remains silent. Margaret tries to distract herself with other activities. She reviews the animal shelter schedule, planning her volunteer hours for the coming week. She writes a thank you note to her neighbor, who'd helped her move a heavy planter the previous week. She starts a grocery list, methodically planning meals for one person with the same care she'd once devoted to feeding a family. But beneath all these activities, she feels the growing weight of disappointment, not just about David's silence, but about the broader pattern it represents. The way relationships can erode so gradually that the erosion becomes normal, acceptable, unremarkable. At exactly 12:15, her laptop chimes with an incoming email. Margaret's heart jumps. Finally, she thinks. David remembered. She opens the email program with the eagerness of someone who's been waiting for good news, who's ready to forgive the lateness in exchange for the gesture. The message is brief, sterile, devoid of warmth. Subject: Happy birthday. Happy birthday. Hope you have a nice day. David. Margaret stares at the screen, reading the message 3 times, as if repetition might reveal some hidden warmth, some coded affection that she's missed. But there's nothing. No mom, no love, no exclamation points to suggest enthusiasm or joy. Just a perfunctory acknowledgement of a biological fact, delivered with all the warmth of a utility bill or a dental appointment reminder. She sits back in her chair, and something unexpected happens. Instead of the crushing disappointment she anticipated, Margaret feels a strange lightness, almost like the urge to laugh. The absurdity of it strikes her with crystal clarity. This is what their relationship has become. 34 years of pregnancy, childbirth, sleepless nights, school plays, soccer games, homework help, college tuition, emotional support, and unconditional love. Reduced to a 7-word email that reads like it was composed by a distant acquaintance. Margaret has spent years making excuses for David's increasing emotional distance. She's told herself that he's busy, that men express affection differently, that his divorce has made him retreat from all relationships. She's accepted shorter phone calls, less frequent visits, more perfunctory interactions, always believing that understanding would somehow bridge the growing gap between them. But this email strips away all the rationalizations. It's not about being busy or emotionally unavailable. It's about priority. It's about the fact that David can write detailed, passionate briefs for his legal cases, but can't manage to write a birthday message that includes her name or expresses genuine feeling. Margaret prints the email. As the paper emerges from her small printer, she studies it. The generic font, the lack of punctuation, the complete absence of personality. It's almost like modern art, she thinks. A perfect representation of emotional distance rendered in Times New Roman. She walks to her bedroom closet and retrieves a box from the top shelf. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, is an ornate golden picture frame, the kind with elaborate scrollwork and decorative flourishes that she'd bought years ago during a moment of retail optimism. It had been intended for a family photo that never materialized, a moment of togetherness that somehow never presented itself. The frame is beautiful in an old-fashioned way, with intricate details that speak of craftsmanship and care. Margaret had imagined it holding a photograph of her and David together, maybe with grandchildren she'd hoped would eventually arrive. Instead, it had sat in her closet, another symbol of expectations that reality had failed to meet. Margaret places David's email in the frame. The contrast is striking. The cold, impersonal message surrounded by gold and ornate beauty, like a museum exhibit titled The Death of Familial Affection, or Communication in the Digital Age. She steps back and looks at her creation. The laugh that has been building in her chest finally escapes, Not bitter or sad, but genuinely amused. This is perfect, she thinks. This is exactly what it should be. The framed email becomes a moment of clarity for Margaret. She's spent years pretending that David's emotional distance is temporary, that the son who once confided in her about everything will eventually return. But the email makes it clear that this is who they are now. Two people who share a history, but no longer share genuine intimacy. And instead of devastation, Margaret feels relief. The truth, even when it's disappointing, is easier to navigate than uncertainty. She knows exactly where she stands now, exactly what she means to David, exactly what she can expect from their relationship going forward. Int. Margaret's house. Living room. Afternoon. Margaret spends the rest of her birthday in what she decides to call radical self-care. She orders takeout from her favorite Thai restaurant, the one that makes pad Thai exactly the way she likes it, with extra peanuts and just a touch of heat. She opens a bottle of wine that she'd been saving for a special occasion, deciding that surviving another year of life with grace and humor qualifies as special enough. She takes a long bath, using the expensive bath salts her sister had given her for Christmas. She lights candles, plays her favorite jazz playlist, and allows herself to feel not sorry for herself, but proud. She's made it this far, largely on her own terms, and that's something worth celebrating. The afternoon passes in a haze of small luxuries. Margaret does things she's been putting off. She calls her sister Patricia, in Portland, not to complain about David but to make plans for a visit. She writes a letter to her former colleague at the library, the one who'd sent her a Christmas card saying she missed their conversations. She orders a book she's been wanting to read, not from the library but for herself, to own and keep. As evening approaches, Margaret looks at the framed email sitting on her kitchen counter. Tomorrow, she decides, she'll take it to David. Not as an act of aggression or manipulation, but as a gift. A mirror that might help him see what their relationship has become. She goes to bed that night feeling lighter than she has in years. Sometimes, she thinks, the greatest gift we can give ourselves is the permission to stop pretending that things are different than they are. Int Margaret's house. Kitchen next morning. Margaret wakes with a sense of purpose she hasn't felt in months. She dresses carefully for her visit to David's office. Not formally, but with the kind of understated elegance that comes from knowing exactly who you are and what you're worth. She chooses a navy blue dress that Robert had always complimented, paired with the pearl earrings David had given her when he'd gotten his first job. She wraps the framed email in tissue paper and places it in a gift bag, not to disguise its contents, but to present it with the ceremony it deserves. This is a moment that requires proper presentation, the kind of attention to detail that makes ordinary events memorable. Before leaving, Margaret stops at her garden to cut a small bouquet of flowers for her kitchen table. As she arranges them in a vase, she realizes this is the first time in months that she's cut flowers for herself rather than for someone else. The gesture feels significant, like a small act of rebellion against the habit of self-neglect. XT, Downtown Business District, morning. The city hums with the energy of people pursuing their ambitions, chasing deadlines, managing crises that will be forgotten by next week. Margaret walks through the streets with the unhurried pace of someone who's learned to distinguish between urgency and importance. She passes coffee shops filled with young professionals clutching laptops and phones, their conversations a mixture of work stress and personal drama. She observes them with the detached interest of someone who's stepped outside the routine of daily urgency, who's learned that most of what seems crucial is actually optional. The building where David works is a monument to professional achievement. Glass and steel reaching toward the sky, designed to impress clients and intimidate competitors. Margaret has been here before, but always for scheduled visits, always with advance notice, always as a planned interruption to David's important work. Today feels different. Today she's not seeking permission or apologizing for her presence. Today she's delivering something that belongs to him. Int downtown office building. Elevator. Continuous. The elevator rises steadily toward the 15th floor, carrying Margaret and her carefully wrapped gift. The elevator stops at various floors, admitting and releasing other passengers. Young associates clutching coffee cups and checking phones. Senior partners with newspapers folded under their arms. Administrative assistants carrying files and flowers for someone's birthday. Margaret observes them all with curious detachment. These are David's people now, the ones who share his daily concerns and celebrations. She wonders if any of them know he has a mother, if he's ever mentioned her in the casual conversations that happen between meetings. At the 15th floor, she exits and walks down the familiar hallway toward Morrison, Chen & Associates. The law firm occupies a suite of offices that represent everything David has worked toward since law school. Polished wood, leather furniture, abstract art that suggests sophistication without threatening comfort. Margaret approaches the reception desk, where a young woman with perfectly styled hair and practiced smile greets her. "Good morning. How can I help you?" "I'm here to see David Thompson. I'm his mother." The receptionist's smile shifts slightly, becoming more genuine. "Of course, Mrs. Thompson. Let me check if he's available." She picks up the phone and speaks in the low, professional tones of someone who's mastered the art of office communication. "David, your mother is here to see you." "Yes, I'll send her back." Margaret follows the familiar path through the office, past the cubicles where junior associates work on cases that will either launch careers or crush dreams. She passes conference rooms where intense conversations happen behind glass walls, where the fate of businesses and families is decided by people who bill their time in 6-minute increments. Int. David's office. Continuous. David Thompson, 34, sits behind a mahogany desk that's sized to impress clients and intimidate opponents. He's everything a successful attorney should be. Well-dressed, articulate, confident in his movements and expressions. The office walls display his law degree, professional certifications, and photographs of him with important clients and colleagues. When Margaret enters, he looks up from his computer with the kind of smile that's polite but distracted, the expression of someone who's calculating how much time this interruption might consume. "Hi, Mom." This is unexpected. He gestures to the chair across from his desk. "Everything okay?" Margaret sits, placing the gift bag beside her chair. "Everything's fine, David. I just wanted to bring you something." "Bring me something?" David's expression shifts to mild curiosity, mixed with the kind of wariness that suggests he's preparing for an emotional conversation he doesn't have time to navigate. "A gift," Margaret says, reaching into the bag. "For your office." She removes the golden frame and places it on David's desk. The ornate scrollwork catches the light from the window, and for a moment the frame's elaborate beauty dominates the space between them. David looks at the frame, then at his printed email contained within it. His face goes through a series of expressions: confusion, recognition, embarrassment, and something that might be defensiveness. "Mom, what is this?" Margaret's voice is calm, almost cheerful. "It's the last thing you sent me with emotion. I thought you might like to display it." David stares at the frame, then at his mother. Around them, the office continues its normal rhythm. Phones ringing, keyboards clicking, the distant sound of colleagues discussing cases and deadlines. But in this moment, the business of law feels insignificant compared to the weight of what's happening between them. "I don't understand," David says, though his tone suggests he understands perfectly. "Yesterday was my birthday," Margaret explains, as if she's discussing the weather. "I woke up hoping for a phone call, maybe a card, perhaps even a visit. Instead, I received this email. 7 words, no punctuation, no warmth. Just a notification that you're aware of my continued existence. David's defensive posture is almost reflexive, the same stance he takes when opposing counsel makes an unexpected argument. Mom, I've been incredibly busy. This merger case is consuming everything. I meant to call, but you didn't. Margaret interrupts gently. You sent an email that could have been composed by a stranger. So I thought you might want to keep it, as a reminder of what we've become. The silence stretches between them, heavy with years of unspoken disappointments and unmet expectations. David's colleagues pass by in the hallway, their conversations a distant murmur that emphasizes the isolation of this moment. Margaret can see David processing this confrontation, trying to find the right response, the appropriate legal argument that might absolve him of responsibility. She recognizes the look. It's the same expression he'd worn as a child, when caught in a mistake, searching for an explanation that would minimize consequences. This is passive-aggressive, Mom. Margaret considers this accusation with the same care she'd give to any serious charge. No, David. Passive-aggressive would be if I sent you a similar email on your birthday, and then acted hurt when you didn't appreciate it. This is just honest. This is me acknowledging that you've told me quite clearly what I mean to you. David picks up the frame, studying his own words encased in gold. The email looks even more stark in this context. Cold, impersonal, devoid of the warmth that once characterized their relationship. I was busy. It doesn't mean I don't care about you. But it means you don't care enough to show it, Margaret replies. And that's information, David. That's data about our relationship that I needed to acknowledge. She stands up, smoothing her dress with the same composure she'd shown throughout the conversation. I'm not here to make you feel guilty. I'm here to give you a gift, the gift of clarity about what we are to each other. David looks up at her, and for a moment she sees not the successful attorney but the little boy who used to run to her when he was hurt, who used to seek her approval for everything from school projects to girlfriend choices. Mom, I don't want us to be strangers. We're not strangers, Margaret says. We're family, but we're family who barely know each other anymore. And that's not entirely your fault. I've been pretending otherwise for years. She moves toward the door, then turns back. The frame is a gift, David, not a guilt trip. Think of it as a mirror. Sometimes we need to see ourselves clearly before we can decide what we want to change. Int, downtown office building. Elevator, continuous. As the elevator descends, Margaret feels a strange sense of completion. She's not angry, not hurt in the way she expected to be. Instead, she feels liberated by honesty, by the act of naming what has been happening between them for years. The elevator stops at the ground floor, and Margaret walks through the lobby toward the street. The city spreads out before her, millions of people navigating their own relationships, their own disappointments, their own moments of clarity. She doesn't feel victorious or vindicated. She feels relieved. For years, she's been participating in a relationship that existed more in her memory than in present reality. David had become a ghost of himself, showing up for obligatory occasions but never really present, never really engaged. The framed email wasn't an attack. It was a mirror. Sometimes, Margaret thinks, we need to see ourselves clearly before we can decide what we want to change. XT, downtown flower shop, continuous. Margaret walks 3 blocks to a flower shop she's passed hundreds of times but never entered. The shop is small, cramped with blooms in every color imaginable, run by a woman about Margaret's age with soil under her fingernails and joy in her eyes. What can I help you find today? The florist asks, wiping her hands on a well-worn apron. Margaret looks around at the abundance of choices. Roses and peonies, orchids and lilies, flowers she recognizes, and exotic blooms she's never seen before. I'd like to buy myself birthday flowers. The most beautiful arrangement you can create. It's your birthday? The woman's smile broadens. Then we need to make something spectacular. What's your favorite color? I don't know, Margaret admits. I've spent so many years buying flowers for other people that I'm not sure what I actually like. The florist nods as if this makes perfect sense. Well, then let's find out. What makes you happy when you look at it? Together they select flowers, not the practical, long-lasting varieties that Margaret might have chosen for someone else, but the extravagant, beautiful blooms that exist purely for the joy of being beautiful. Peonies and roses, orchids and lilies, colors that shouldn't work together but somehow do. These are for you, the florist asks, as she arranges the flowers with the skill of someone who's spent years understanding how beauty works. Yes, from me to me. The woman pauses in her work, looking at Margaret with new interest. The best gifts usually are. Most people spend their whole lives waiting for someone else to give them what they want. Takes courage to give it to yourself. Margaret pays for the flowers and walks home carrying the most beautiful arrangement she's ever owned. People on the street notice. Several strangers smile at her, and one elderly man tips his hat and says, "Someone's having a good day." "Yes," Margaret tells him. "I am." Int Margaret's house. Living room. Later. Margaret places the flowers on her dining table where they transform the entire room. She steps back and admires them, not just their beauty, but what they represent. For the first time in years, she's given herself exactly what she wanted, without waiting for someone else to provide it. The flowers are extravagant, impractical, purely aesthetic. They'll last only a week, maybe less. But they're beautiful now, in this moment, and Margaret has decided that's enough. She makes herself lunch, not the simple fare she usually prepares, but something elaborate and satisfying. She opens another bottle of wine, the good kind she's been saving for company that never comes. She puts on music and dances in her living room, feeling foolish and free and completely herself. The phone rings. It's David. "Hi, Mom." "Hello, David. I've been thinking about what you said. About the frame." Margaret waits, giving him space to find his words. She doesn't rush to fill the silence or make the conversation easier for him. "I guess I have been distant lately. This case, the divorce, everything." "David," Margaret interrupts gently, "you don't owe me an explanation. You owe me honesty. We both do. I don't know how to do this anymore," David admits, his voice losing some of its professional polish. "I don't know how to be your son without feeling like I'm failing at everything else." Margaret sits down in Robert's chair, looking at her beautiful flowers. "You're not failing, David. You're just prioritizing. I understand that. I just needed you to understand that I see it clearly." "The frame is still sitting on my desk," David says. "People have been asking about it." "What do you tell them?" "That it's a reminder of what matters." Margaret smiles. "That's exactly what it is." They talk for another 20 minutes. Not about the case or the divorce or the obligations that consume David's life, but about small things. Margaret tells him about the flowers, about her book club, about the new cat at the animal shelter, who reminds her of the pet David had when he was 12. David tells her about a movie he saw, about a colleague who reminds him of his father, about how he's thinking of taking a vacation. When they hang up, Margaret doesn't feel that their relationship has been magically healed. But she feels that it's been honestly acknowledged. Sometimes, she thinks, that's the first step toward anything real. Int Margaret's house. Bedroom night. Margaret prepares for bed with the same care she's shown herself all day. She applies her night cream, brushes her teeth, and puts on her most comfortable pajamas. Before getting into bed, she stops at the window and looks out at the city lights. Tomorrow, she thinks, she'll call her sister Patricia in Portland. She'll make concrete plans to visit, not just vague promises to get together soon. She'll schedule lunch with her book club friends, individually, not just as a group. She'll write letters to people she's lost touch with, not because she expects responses, but because she wants to reach out. Margaret has spent years waiting for other people to make her feel valuable, wanted, remembered. Today she's learned that she can provide those things for herself, not as a consolation prize, but as a fundamental truth about human worth. She gets into bed and picks up her book, but her eyes drift to the empty picture frame on her dresser, the companion to the one now sitting on David's desk. Tomorrow, she decides, she'll put her own picture in it. Not a photo of her with someone else, but a portrait of herself, taken on the day she learned that her love for others doesn't require their love in return. Margaret turns off the light and settles into sleep, surrounded by the lingering scent of her birthday flowers and the quiet satisfaction of a woman who has finally learned to give herself what she deserves. 3 months later, Aunt Margaret's house, living room, afternoon. Margaret's house has transformed subtly but significantly. There are more flowers, not just special occasion arrangements, but small bouquets that she buys for herself weekly. The walls now display artwork she's purchased simply because it makes her happy, not because it matches her decor or might impress visitors. She's hosting her book club today, and the house buzzes with the energy of 6 women who've found their voices and aren't afraid to use them. The discussion is lively, ranging from the novel they're supposed to be discussing to politics, travel plans, and relationship advice that's both practical and irreverent. "I'm thinking about taking a pottery class," announces Sarah, a recently divorced teacher who's been exploring new interests with the enthusiasm of someone making up for lost time. "Do it," encourages Linda, a retired nurse who started hiking again after years of putting everyone else's needs first. "I signed up for that photography workshop I've been talking about for years." Margaret listens to her friends with the pleasure of someone who's found her tribe. These women have become more than book club members. They're witnesses to each other's growth, cheerleaders for each other's adventures, sources of wisdom and laughter and support. "Margaret," says Patricia, not her sister, but another Patricia who joined the group 6 months ago. "You seem different lately. Happier." Margaret considers this observation. "I think I've learned the difference between being loved and being valued. I've always been valuable. I just forgot that I was the one who got to decide that." The women nod, understanding in the way that comes from shared experience. They've all learned, in their own ways, that the most important relationship they'll ever have is the one they have with themselves. Margaret's phone buzzes with a text from David. "Happy Tuesday, Mom. Thinking of you. Want to have dinner this weekend? It's not much, but it's real. And it's unprompted." The golden frame still sits on his desk, but now it's accompanied by a recent photo of Margaret in her garden, smiling at the camera with the confidence of someone who knows her worth. As the afternoon progresses, Margaret realizes that the golden frame wasn't just a gift for David. It was a gift for herself, a reminder that she deserves more than the minimum effort, more than afterthoughts, more than the emotional scraps that people offer when they're too busy to provide anything substantial. Into Margaret's house, kitchen, evening. After her friends leave, Margaret prepares dinner for herself with the same care she once devoted to cooking for a family. She's learned to appreciate the ritual of cooking, the meditation of chopping vegetables, the satisfaction of creating something beautiful and nourishing. She's invited David for dinner this weekend. Not a special occasion, just a regular Saturday night. He'd accepted immediately, suggesting that perhaps the golden frame had accomplished something, after all. Margaret doesn't expect their relationship to return to what it was when David was young, but she hopes it might become something honest, something real, something worth the effort they both put into it. She arranges her latest flowers, yellow roses this time because they make her happy. and sets the table for one. She's learned to appreciate her own company, to find contentment in solitude, rather than seeing it as something to be endured. Int. Margaret's house. Living room. Night. Margaret settles into Robert's chair with her book and a cup of tea. The house is quiet but not empty. It's filled with the evidence of a life being lived intentionally. Books she's chosen, art that makes her smile, flowers that exist purely for beauty. She thinks about the woman she was 3 months ago, waiting for phone calls that didn't come, accepting scraps of attention as if they were gifts. That woman feels like a stranger now, someone who'd forgotten her own worth in the process of loving others. The golden frame had been a catalyst, but not in the way she'd expected. It hadn't changed David, not immediately anyway. But it had changed her. It had forced her to stop pretending that settling for less was the same as being understanding. Margaret's phone rings. It's her sister Patricia in Portland. "Hey, little sister. How was your day?" "Good," Margaret says, meaning it. "Really good." They talk for an hour, making plans for Patricia's visit next month, sharing stories about their respective adventures in rediscovering themselves. Patricia is taking art classes, dating again after her husband's death 2 years ago, learning to travel alone. "You know what I realized?" Patricia says as their conversation winds down. "We spent so many years being what other people needed us to be, that we forgot who we actually were." Margaret nods, even though her sister can't see her. "But it's not too late to remember." "No," Patricia agrees. "It's not too late at all." 6 months later. Iras. Margaret's house, dining room, evening. Margaret sets the table for 2 with her good china, the set she'd been saving for special occasions that never seemed to arrive. Tonight David is coming for dinner, not because it's a holiday or birthday, but because they've established a monthly tradition of sharing a meal and actually talking. The golden frame still sits on David's desk at work, but their relationship has evolved beyond the stark honesty it represented. They've learned to communicate with genuine interest rather than obligation, to share their lives rather than simply update each other on logistics. David arrives with a bottle of wine and a small bouquet of flowers. Not extravagant, but thoughtful. "Hi, Mom. The garden looks incredible." "Thank you. I've been experimenting with some new varieties." They move through the evening with the ease of people who've learned to appreciate each other's company. David tells her about his cases, his plans to take a sabbatical, his slow recovery from the divorce. Margaret shares stories about her book club, her volunteer work, her growing friendship with the florist, who's become something like a mentor in the art of living beautifully. "I've been thinking about what you said," David says as they clear the dishes. "About the frame being a mirror." Margaret pauses, a plate in her hands. "And what did you see?" "Someone who'd forgotten how to be a son," David admits. "Someone who'd convinced himself that being successful was more important than being present." They finish cleaning up in comfortable silence, the kind that comes from years of shared history and recent honesty. Margaret makes coffee, and they sit in the living room, where the light is soft and the flowers on the table catch the evening sun. "I've started therapy," David says, not looking at her but at his hands folded in his lap. "After the divorce, I thought I just needed to work harder, make more money, prove that I was successful. But success doesn't mean anything if you're alone." Margaret sets down her coffee cup. "You're not alone, David. You never were. You just stopped letting people in, including you, especially me." They sit with this truth for a moment. Margaret doesn't rush to comfort him or minimize his realization. She's learned that people need space to understand their own patterns, their own choices. "The therapist says I compartmentalize," David continues. "That I treat relationships like items on a to-do list, instead of connections that need attention and care. That's not entirely wrong," Margaret says gently. But understanding it is the first step toward changing it. David looks at her then. Really looks at her, as if seeing her for the first time in years. You're different, Mom. Since the birthday thing, you're more yourself. Margaret smiles. I decided to stop waiting for other people to make me feel important. It's liberating. I'm sorry I made you feel unimportant. You didn't make me feel anything, Margaret corrects. I chose to interpret your actions as a reflection of my worth. That was my mistake, not yours. David shakes his head. No, Mom. My actions were about my priorities, and my priorities were wrong. They talk until nearly midnight, the kind of conversation Margaret had thought was impossible. Honest, vulnerable, without the careful navigation of previous years. When David leaves, he hugs her with genuine warmth, not the perfunctory embrace that had become their standard goodbye. Same time next month? He asks. I'll be here, Margaret promises. 1 year later. Int. Margaret's house. Garden morning. Margaret works in her garden, her hands deep in soil, planting bulbs that will bloom next spring. The garden has expanded over the past year, spilling beyond its original boundaries to include a small greenhouse where she starts seedlings, and a sitting area where she drinks her morning coffee. She's wearing old clothes and has dirt under her fingernails. But she's never felt more elegant. This is her domain, the place where she creates beauty without anyone's permission or approval. Her phone buzzes with a text from David. Thinking of you this morning. Remember, dinner at my place, Sunday. I'm cooking. The message is followed by a photo of him in his kitchen, flour on his apron, looking harried but happy. Margaret smiles. David has been learning to cook, part of his broader project of learning to care for himself and others. Their Sunday dinners have become sacred time, protected from work calls and outside obligations. Another text arrives, this one from Patricia. Flight confirmed. Can't wait to see you next week. And yes, I'm bringing my art supplies. Margaret's sister has been visiting every few months, their relationship revitalized by their mutual journey toward authentic living. Patricia is painting again, something she'd abandoned after marriage and children. Margaret has started writing, not for publication but for the joy of capturing moments and memories. Int. Margaret's house. Living room. Afternoon. Margaret's book club has grown to include 12 women, and monthly meetings have become weekly gatherings. Today they're not discussing a book, but sharing stories about their adventures in self-discovery. I signed up for that senior dating site, announces Helen, a widow who'd been married for 47 years. Had my first coffee date yesterday. How was it? Asks Sarah, who's been chronicling her own dating adventures with humor and wisdom. Terrible. Helen laughs. But I felt alive in a way I haven't in years. I'm going to try again. Margaret listens to her friends with deep appreciation. These women have become her chosen family, the people who celebrate her victories and support her through challenges. They've created a community based on honesty, humor, and mutual encouragement. I have news, Margaret announces. I've been accepted into the Master Gardener program at the community college. The women erupt in congratulations. Margaret had applied on a whim, thinking she was too old to start something new. But the program coordinator had been delighted by her application, her passion for plants, her years of practical experience. It's a 2-year program, Margaret explains. I'll be 64 when I finish, but I realize that I'll be 64 anyway, so I might as well be 64 with a certification in something I love. Int. Margaret's house. Kitchen's evening. Margaret prepares dinner for herself and David, who's coming over to help her plan the greenhouse expansion. These shared projects have become part of their relationship. Practical ways to spend time together while creating something lasting. The golden frame sits on Margaret's kitchen counter now, moved from David's office to a place where she sees it daily. It's become a reminder not of disappointment, but of transformation. The moment when she chose honesty over pretense, self-respect over self-pity. David arrives with blueprints and measuring tape, his lawyer's attention to detail now applied to his mother's gardening ambitions. They spread the plans across the kitchen table, discussing drainage and ventilation with the seriousness of people planning a cathedral. "I've been thinking about Dad lately," David says as they work. "About how he used to help you with projects like this." Margaret pauses in her measurements. "He would have loved this. He always said that gardens were acts of faith. You plant something, not knowing if it will grow, but believing it will. Like relationships," David observes. "Exactly like relationships. They work in comfortable silence, each absorbed in the technical details but aware of the deeper significance of what they're doing. This greenhouse represents more than Margaret's gardening hobby. It's a symbol of growth, of investment in the future, of the belief that beautiful things are worth the effort required to create them." Enter Margaret's house, living room. Night. After David leaves, Margaret sits in Robert's chair with a photo album, looking through pictures that span decades of her life. There are photos of her as a young mother, tired but radiant, holding David as an infant. Images of family vacations, birthday parties, graduations, all the markers of a life lived in service to others. But scattered throughout are photos of Margaret alone, in her garden, at the library where she worked, with friends, pursuing her own interests. These photos tell a different story, one of a woman who'd always had her own identity, but had sometimes forgotten to nurture it. Margaret turns to a blank page and tapes in a recent photo of herself. Not a formal portrait, but a candid shot that David had taken during one of their dinners. She's laughing at something he'd said, her face animated with genuine joy. It's a picture of a woman who knows her worth, who's learned to find happiness in her own company, while remaining open to connection with others. She writes beneath the photo, "Age 63. Finally learned that loving others doesn't require losing myself." 2 years later. Inti. Community College. Greenhouse. Day. Margaret stands before a group of new students, wearing the green apron that marks her as a certified master gardener. At 64, she's found her calling as a teacher, sharing not just technical knowledge, but the deeper wisdom that comes from years of nurturing growth. "The most important thing about gardening," she tells her students, "is understanding that you can't control everything. You can provide the right conditions, but each plant will grow according to its own nature." A young woman raises her hand. "What if a plant doesn't grow the way you expected?" Margaret smiles. "Then you have 2 choices. You can keep trying to force it into your vision, or you can appreciate what it's actually becoming. Usually the second option is more successful." After class, Margaret walks through the college gardens, admiring the work of previous students. Each section reflects different personalities, different approaches to beauty and function. The diversity makes the whole garden more interesting, more alive. Her phone rings. It's David, calling from his office. "Hi, Mom. Just wanted to hear your voice." "Hi, sweetheart. How was your day?" "Good. Busy, but good. I'm leaving the office in an hour to pick up groceries for tomorrow's dinner. Any requests?" Margaret has been invited to David's apartment for their weekly dinner. But tomorrow is special. David is introducing her to someone new, a woman he's been dating for several months. Margaret is nervous but excited, hopeful that David has learned to balance his professional ambitions with his personal life. "Just bring yourself," Margaret says, "and maybe some flowers for the table." "Already on the list." David laughs. "I learned from the best." David's apartment. Dining room. Evening. David's apartment reflects his growth over the past 2 years. It's still professional and elegant, but it's also personal. Photos of him and Margaret, books that aren't related to law, plants that he's learned to keep alive. The golden frame sits on his bookshelf now, not prominently displayed but visible to anyone who takes the time to look. It's become a conversation starter, a way for David to tell people about the most important lesson he's learned. That relationships require attention, not just intention. Margaret meets Sarah Chen, David's girlfriend, a pediatric nurse who shares his sense of humor and his growing appreciation for work-life balance. Sarah is warm, intelligent, and clearly smitten with David in a way that makes Margaret's heart sing. "David talks about you constantly," Sarah tells Margaret as they sit down to dinner. "He says you taught him that love is a verb, not just a feeling." Margaret looks at her son, who's blushing slightly but smiling. "He's a good student when he applies himself." The evening unfolds with the easy rhythm of people who genuinely enjoy each other's company. They talk about Sarah's work with children, Margaret's teaching, David's latest case. But mostly they talk about small things. Movies they've seen, books they've read, places they'd like to visit. "I have something to tell you both," David says as they're having dessert. "I've been thinking about taking that sabbatical we discussed. 6 months, maybe longer." Margaret sets down her fork. "What would you do with the time? Travel. Think. Maybe write a book about work-life balance for lawyers. Spend time with people I care about." Sarah reaches for his hand. "I think it's a wonderful idea." Margaret nods. "Your father always said that the best investment you can make is in yourself. Time is the only currency that really matters." Int. Margaret's house. Bedroom night. Margaret prepares for bed with the same care she's shown herself for the past 2 years. She's learned that small rituals of self-care aren't selfish, but necessary. They're how she maintains the energy and spirit needed to be present for others. She looks at the photos on her dresser. Recent pictures of her and David. Images from her travels with Patricia. Snapshots from book club gatherings. Each photo tells a story of relationship, of connection, of love that's been earned rather than assumed. The empty frame she'd bought years ago now holds a collage of images from her Master Gardener program. Photos of her teaching, gardening, laughing with students and colleagues. It's a visual representation of a life being lived with purpose and joy. Margaret's phone buzzes with a text from David. "Thank you for tonight. Sarah loves you already. I'm so glad you're my mom." Margaret smiles, typing back. "I'm glad you're my son. Always have been. Always will be." She turns off the light and settles into sleep, surrounded by the evidence of a life well lived, not perfect, but authentic. She's learned that the most important gift she can give others is the example of someone who knows her worth, who nurtures her own growth, who loves without losing herself. 3 years later, Exeter Margaret's house, garden morning. Margaret's garden has become a showplace, featured in the local newspaper, and visited by Master Gardener students from across the region. But for Margaret, it remains what it's always been, a place of peace, creation, and connection with the earth. She's working alongside David and Sarah, who've become regular helpers in her gardening projects. David has discovered that he enjoys physical labor, the satisfaction of creating something with his hands rather than just his mind. "I never thought I'd say this," David says, wiping sweat from his forehead. "But I actually look forward to these Saturday morning garden sessions." "It's meditation," Sarah observes, tamping soil around a newly planted rosebush. "You can't think about anything else when you're gardening." Margaret nods. "That's why I love it. It keeps me present." They work in comfortable silence, 3 generations of care and attention evident in every carefully tended plant. The garden has become a metaphor for their relationship, something that requires consistent attention, but rewards that care with beauty and abundance. Int. Margaret's house. Living room. Afternoon. Margaret is hosting a larger gathering today. Not just her book club, but a celebration of her 65th birthday. The house is full of people who've become important to her over the past few years. Her master gardener students, her neighbors, her sister Patricia, who's visiting from Portland. The golden frame sits on the mantel now, part of a display that includes photos from Margaret's teaching, certificates from her master gardener program, and a small plaque that reads, "The most beautiful thing about a garden is that it teaches you that growth never stops." David stands to make a toast, raising his glass of wine. 3 years ago, my mother gave me a gift that changed my life. It wasn't the gift I expected, but it was the gift I needed. He looks at Margaret, his eyes bright with unshed tears. She taught me that love isn't about making people comfortable with your limitations. It's about challenging them to become their best selves, even when that's uncomfortable. The room falls silent, everyone sensing the weight of the moment. Mom, you could have accepted my emotional laziness and pretended it was enough. Instead, you held up a mirror and showed me what I was becoming. It was the most loving thing anyone has ever done for me. Margaret feels tears in her own eyes but doesn't look away from her son. You were always worth the effort, David. You just needed to remember that. To Margaret, David says, raising his glass higher. Who taught us all that? The most important relationship we have is the one with ourselves. The room erupts in applause and agreement. Margaret looks around at the faces of people who have become her chosen family, people who celebrate her victories and support her through challenges. Int Margaret's house, kitchen, evening. After the guests leave, Margaret and David clean up together, moving with the easy efficiency of people who have done this many times before. Sarah has gone home to prepare for her night shift at the hospital, but not before helping organize the leftover food and flowers. "I have something for you," David says, reaching into his jacket pocket. A real birthday present this time. He hands her a small wrapped package. Inside is a gold locket, simple but elegant, with an inscription. "To Mom, who taught me that love is a verb. Always, David." Margaret opens the locket to find 2 photos, one of her and David from his childhood, and one taken just that afternoon in the garden, both of them dirty and laughing, and completely present. "It's perfect," Margaret says, fastening the locket around her neck. "But you didn't need to get me anything. Having you here, really here, is gift enough." David hugs her, and Margaret feels the difference in his embrace. It's not perfunctory or rushed, but genuine and warm. "I love you, Mom. I love you too, sweetheart." Int Margaret's house. Living room, night. Margaret sits in Robert's chair, the same place where she'd sat 3 years ago, waiting for phone calls that didn't come. But everything has changed, not just her relationship with David, but her relationship with herself. She's learned that self-respect isn't selfish but essential, that loving others doesn't require losing herself, that the most important gift she can give is the example of someone who knows her worth and insists that others recognize it too. The golden frame catches the light from the lamp beside her chair. What had started as a moment of painful honesty has become a symbol of transformation, proof that difficult conversations can lead to deeper connection, that our honesty can be more loving than pretense. Margaret picks up her journal, a habit she's developed over the past year. She writes about the day's celebration, about the people who've become important to her, about the lessons she's learned and the ones she's still learning. "Today I turned 65, she writes. "I am surrounded by people who see me, value me, and love me, not for what I do for them, but for who I am. It took me 62 years to learn that this was possible, but I'm grateful I learned it at all." She closes the journal and looks around her living room, at the photos that tell the story of her life, the flowers that exist purely for beauty, the books that feed her mind and spirit. This is a life lived with intention, with self-respect, with the courage to demand authenticity from herself and others. Margaret's phone buzzes with a text from Patricia. Thank you for the wonderful weekend. You've created something beautiful. Not just the garden, but the life you're living. I'm proud to be your sister. Another text follows, this one from Sarah. Thank you for welcoming me into your family. David is lucky to have you as a mother. And finally, David. Best birthday celebration ever. Thank you for being exactly who you are. Margaret smiles, setting the phone aside. She's learned that the most important messages aren't always the ones we wait for, but the ones we choose to send, to ourselves and others, about worth, love, and the courage to live authentically. She turns off the lights and heads to bed, carrying with her the quiet satisfaction of a woman who has learned to give herself what she deserves and to expect the same from others. The golden frame will remain on the mantel, a reminder not of disappointment, but of transformation. Proof that sometimes the most loving thing we can do is refuse to accept less than we're worth. Fade to black. Epilogue. 5 years later. Int. Margaret's house. Garden room. Morning. Margaret, now 70, sits in her expanded garden room, surrounded by the plants she's nurtured over the years. The greenhouse has become a sanctuary, a place where she teaches, creates, and finds peace. The golden frame sits on a small table beside her chair, not prominently displayed but always visible, a reminder of the journey that brought her here. She's writing in her journal, documenting not just the day's gardening activities, but her thoughts about growth, change, and the ways that people can surprise themselves. Outside, David and Sarah work in the garden with their 2-year-old daughter, Emma, who's already showing signs of inheriting her grandmother's love of plants. "Grandma Maggie!" Emma calls, running into the greenhouse with dirt-covered hands and a flower clutched in her fist. "For you!" Margaret accepts the slightly wilted daisy with the same appreciation she'd show for an expensive bouquet. "It's beautiful, sweetheart." "Thank you." Emma climbs onto Margaret's lap, settling in with the confidence of a child who's never doubted her welcome. Margaret breathes in the scent of sunshine and innocence, feeling the weight of this small person who calls her Grandma Maggie, and lights up when she enters a room. "Tell me about the flowers," Emma demands, pointing to the various plants around them. Margaret begins to explain, using simple words but treating Emma's questions with the same respect she'd show an adult student. This is how love works, she thinks, with attention, with patience, with the belief that every person deserves to be heard and valued. Through the window, she watches David and Sarah working together, their movements synchronized by years of partnership and shared purpose. David had taken that sabbatical, spent 6 months traveling and thinking and writing. When he returned, he'd restructured his practice to focus on work-life balance, becoming an advocate for sustainable success rather than success at any cost. The golden frame had started it all, a moment of painful honesty that had become the foundation for authentic relationship. Margaret had learned that the most loving thing she could do was refuse to enable others' emotional laziness, and that self-respect wasn't selfish, but necessary for genuine connection. "Grandma Maggie," Emma says, interrupting Margaret's thoughts. "Why do you have that picture on your table?" Margaret looks at the framed email, now almost 5 years old. "It's a reminder, sweetheart. Sometimes we need to remember where we came from to appreciate where we are." Emma studies the frame with the serious attention of a toddler. "It's not very pretty." Margaret laughs. "No, it's not. But it's honest. And sometimes honesty is more important than pretty. I like pretty better," Emma declares with the certainty of someone who hasn't yet learned that life requires compromise. "So do I," Margaret agrees, hugging her granddaughter closer. "That's why I make sure to surround myself with beautiful things now." She looks around the greenhouse, at the flowers she's cultivated, the photos of people she loves, the evidence of a life lived with intention and joy. The golden frame sits among it all, no longer a symbol of disappointment, but of transformation. Proof that sometimes the most beautiful flowers grow from the most honest soil. Fade out. Done to the end. Final author's note. This extended narrative explores the profound transformation that occurs when someone chooses self-respect over self-pity, honesty over comfortable illusions. Margaret's journey from a woman who waited for others to validate her worth to someone who creates her own meaning and demands authentic connection represents a fundamental shift in how we can approach relationships and self-worth. The story demonstrates that love isn't about making others comfortable with our limitations, but about challenging them and ourselves to become better versions of who we are. Margaret's gift to David wasn't punishment, but clarity, the mirror that allowed him to see what their relationship had become and choose what he wanted it to be. Through 5 years of development, we see how one moment of painful honesty can become the foundation for authentic relationship. Margaret's transformation isn't about becoming someone new, but about remembering who she's always been and insisting that others recognize and respect that person. The golden frame serves as a recurring symbol throughout the narrative, initially representing disappointment and emotional distance, but eventually becoming a reminder of the courage required to demand authenticity from ourselves and others. It shows that sometimes the most loving thing we can do is refuse to accept less than we deserve. The story ultimately suggests that self-respect is not selfish, but essential, that we teach people how to treat us by what we're willing to accept, and that the most important relationship we'll ever have is the one with ourselves. Margaret's journey reminds us that it's never too late to choose authenticity over pretense, self-respect over self-sacrifice, and honest connection over comfortable distance. In the end, Margaret doesn't just find happiness. She creates it, nurtures it, and shares it with others who are worthy of her time and attention. The golden frame remains as proof that sometimes the most beautiful transformations begin with the courage to name what is, rather than pretending it's something else.